Zishreya sat in her quarters on Station Meridian 7, staring at the viewport as distant stars blurred into streaks of light. 247 cycles since her hatching. 2 years since the Battle of Krevlor, where enemy fire had shattered her spine and with it her throne. She remembered that day with painful clarity. The enemy fleet had appeared without warning, tearing through her defensive line like paper. She'd been commanding from the bridge of her flagship, the Crimson Dawn, when the blast hit. One moment she was giving orders, her voice echoing through the command deck. The next, everything went white. Then came the pain. Then came the silence, the terrible silence of legs that would never answer her again. The Scalarics Empire had no use for a crippled Empress. Her scales still shimmered crimson and gold, catching the artificial light of her quarters in the same way they once caught twin suns of her homeworld. Her wings still bore the ceremonial marks of royalty, intricate patterns burned into the membrane during her coronation, symbols that marked her as chosen by the ancestors. But her legs would never carry her again. And in her culture, a ruler who could not stand was not a ruler at all. The council had been swift, efficient. They stripped her titles in less than a week, citing ancient laws she'd once enforced herself. Physical perfection was divine mandate. Weakness in the body meant weakness in the soul. She'd argued, pleaded, reminded them of her 30 years of service, her victories, her wisdom. None of it mattered. Her nephew took the throne before her wounds had even healed. She had been exiled here, to this human diplomatic station, given a title that meant nothing. Ambassador. A courtesy. A polite way to discard her while maintaining diplomatic relations with the species she once ruled. The humans had accepted her without question, offering her these quarters and a stipend. They treated her with respect, but it felt hollow. They didn't understand what she'd lost. Her anti-gravity chair hummed softly beneath her, compensating for muscles that no longer responded. The humans had built it for her with remarkable precision. It moved smoothly, responded to her thoughts through a neural link, never faltered or failed. Their technology was impressive, she had to admit. But it would never be the same as walking on her own clawed feet, feeling the ground beneath her, standing tall as an empress should stand. The chair was a cage made of kindness. A beautiful, functional cage. She looked around her quarters. They were spacious by station standards. The humans had given her one of the larger diplomatic suites. But compared to her palace chambers back home, with their vaulted ceilings and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, this felt like a box. Everything here was designed for humans. The doorways were the right height for them. The furniture built for their proportions. Even the gravity was calibrated to their homeworld, slightly lighter than she preferred. Her communication console remained dark. No messages. No well wishes. The human diplomats had sent brief, formal greetings earlier in the day, "Happy birthday, Ambassador," and "Best wishes on your special day," but they were busy with the trade summit. 3 alien delegations had arrived yesterday, and the humans were running between meetings, trying to broker deals that would benefit everyone. She understood. She'd once done the same, juggling a dozen political fires while barely sleeping. Everyone was always busy. And she was always alone. Back home, her hatching day had been a planetary celebration. Parades in the capital. Feasts in every province. Her subjects would line the streets to catch a glimpse of her flying overhead, her wings spread wide, her scales catching the light. Now, she sat in a small room on a human station, forgotten by her people, unknown to these aliens who passed her in the corridors without a second glance. A soft hissing sound interrupted her thoughts. At first, she thought it was the air recycling system. It always made strange noises. But then she saw the water. It pooled across the polished floor, spreading from beneath the wall panel near her washing station. The puddle grew quickly, reflecting the lights above in rippling patterns. Perfect. Just perfect. Zihreya sighed and activated her console, navigating to the maintenance request system. Her clawed fingers moved across the interface with practiced ease. At least the humans made their technology accessible. She'd give them that much. "Station maintenance, this is Rodriguez. How can I help you today?" The voice was young, female, cheerful in that way humans often were. "This is Ambassador Zihreya in quarters C-47. I have a water leak. It appears to be coming from the wall panel." "Oh no, that's not good. Let me check the schedule." Pause. Keyboard clicking in the background. "Okay, I can have someone there in 20 minutes. Will that work?" 20 minutes. 20 minutes to sit in a growing puddle of water, watching it spread across her floor like her empire had once spread across the stars. 20 minutes to be reminded that even her living space rejected her. "That will be acceptable," Zihreya said, keeping her voice neutral. "Great. Someone will be right there. Sorry about the trouble. The console went dark again. HFY maneuvered her chair backward, away from the expanding water. It had already reached the edge of her meditation mat, soaking into the woven fibers. That mat had been a gift from her sister, one of the few things she'd been allowed to take when they exiled her. Now it was ruined. She watched the water spread and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was her life now. Sitting alone in a small room, waiting for maintenance workers to fix problems she couldn't fix herself, celebrating birthdays that nobody remembered, holding a title that meant nothing. The Dragon Empress of the Scalarics Empire had fallen far indeed. The plumber who arrived wasn't what HFY expected. Most humans on the station were young, efficient, polite to the point of coldness. They'd fix things quickly and leave without making eye contact, as if being in her presence made them uncomfortable. This one was different. He looked middle-aged, with gray threading through his brown hair and permanent creases around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. His jumpsuit had coffee stains on the sleeve and a patch on the knee that had been sewn back together rather than replaced. "Tom Richards," he said, setting down his toolkit without ceremony. No bowing. No staring at her chair. No uncomfortable silence where he'd clearly been briefed about who she was and what had happened to her. He just looked at the water spreading across her floor and shook his head. "Well, that's not supposed to be doing that. Let's see what we're dealing with." He knelt by the wall panel and began working immediately, muttering to himself as he traced pipes and checked connections. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. HFY watched him, uncertain. Most technicians worked in tense silence around her, as if afraid one wrong word might offend the fallen Empress. They'd finish as quickly as possible and practically run for the door. Tom pulled out a small light and shone it into the wall cavity, tilting his head to see better. "Okay, there's your problem. Pressure valves worn out. Happens sometimes with the older installations." He glanced around at her quarters, taking in the layout. "How long have you been living here?" 2 years, HFY said quietly. 2 years with a valve that's been slowly failing. Nobody caught it during inspections? He made a disapproving sound. "That's sloppy work. Should have been replaced ages ago." There was no judgment in his voice when he spoke to her, no pity. Just honest frustration at a job done poorly. It was refreshing in a way she hadn't expected. "Huh," Tom said after a few minutes, sitting back on his heels. "Your water systems are angled for bipedal motion patterns. Someone installed these assuming you'd be standing at the sink, reaching at specific heights." He glanced back at her, really looking at her chair for the first time, but not with discomfort. More like a carpenter examining a piece of furniture. "That's lousy design." HFY blinked. "It is standard for the station. Standard for humans, maybe. Not standard for you." He pulled out a small datapad from his pocket and started sketching with his finger, drawing quick lines and angles. "Your chair puts you at a different height. Different reach angles. Whoever installed this didn't think about that. They just slapped in the default setup and called it done." She found herself explaining Scalarics physiology before she even realized she was doing it. How their longer arm span meant they reached differently than humans. How they preferred lower water temperatures because their scales regulated heat better in cooler conditions. How their clawed hands gripped differently than human fingers, needing different types of handles and controls. She expected him to lose interest halfway through, to nod politely and return to his work like everyone else did when she talked about her people. Instead, Tom listened. Actually listened. He asked questions that showed he was paying attention. How much cooler did she prefer the water? What angle was most comfortable for her to reach at? Did the spray pattern from the current fixtures work for her scales or did it feel harsh? He made notes on his datapad after each answer, sketching modifications and adjustments. Could redesign this whole setup, he mused, more to himself than to her. Lower counters here, adjust the pressure valves, add motion sensors calibrated for your chair's movement. Wouldn't be hard. Just need someone to actually think about who's using it. HFY stared at him. "You would modify the station for me?" Tom looked up from his datapad, genuinely confused by her surprise. "Why not? If something doesn't work for the person using it, you fix it. That's just common sense." He gestured at the wall panel he just repaired. "I mean, I wouldn't build a ladder for someone without legs and then act surprised when they couldn't use it, right? Same principle. Design should serve people, not the other way around." It was such a simple statement, delivered so casually, but it hit HFY like a physical blow. In her empire, the idea would have been reversed. People should adapt to serve the design, the structure, the way things had always been. If you couldn't fit the mold, you were broken. You were useless. But here was this human plumber with coffee stains on his sleeve and grease under his fingernails, saying the exact opposite like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He finished the repair, testing the valve twice to make sure it held. The water stopped flowing. He packed his tools methodically, making sure everything was in its proper place in the kit. The kind of care that spoke of years of habit. Tom stood and paused at the door, his eyes catching the date display on her console. The station kept track of important dates for all residents. Hers had been marked in the system, though nobody had done anything with that information except send those brief, formal messages. "Hey," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "Is today your birthday?" Zichrea's crest flattened against her head, an instinctive response she couldn't control. "My hatching day." "Yes." Tom's expression shifted to something she couldn't quite read. His eyebrows drew together and the creases around his eyes deepened, but not with disgust or pity. It looked more like concern. Maybe disappointment. "That's no good," he said quietly, and there was genuine feeling in those words. Nobody should be alone on their birthday. He said it like it was a fundamental truth, like it violated some basic law of the universe that she was sitting here by herself on what should have been a day of celebration. Zichrea didn't know what to say to that. So she said nothing. Tom nodded to himself, like he'd made some kind of decision. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on that valve. Make sure it's holding proper." He gave her a small smile. "Have a good rest of your day, Ambassador." And then he was gone, leaving Zichrea sitting in her quarters, staring at the door he'd just walked through. For the first time in 2 years, someone had seen her as a person with a problem to solve, not as a problem herself. Tom returned the next morning with blueprints. Zichrea had been composing a routine diplomatic report when her door chimed. The sound startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. The trade summit was still going on, and most of the station's human staff were tied up with that. She activated the door panel, and it slid open to reveal the plumber from yesterday, holding a datapad in one hand and a small insulated container in the other. He looked slightly sheepish, like a student who'd done extra homework nobody asked for. "So I might have stayed up late redesigning your quarters," Tom admitted, stepping inside when she gestured him in. "Hope that's not weird." Zichrea's crest lifted slightly in confusion. "Redesigning? I thought you were just checking the valve." "Yeah, about that." Tom set down the insulated container on her table and pulled up his datapad, fingers swiping through screens. "I got home yesterday and couldn't stop thinking about how badly your place is set up. Kept bugging me. So I pulled up the station's architectural database and started playing around with some ideas." He turned the datapad toward her, and Zichrea's breath caught. The screen showed a complete three-dimensional layout of her quarters, but transformed. He'd redesigned everything. "Okay, so here's what I'm thinking," Tom said, zooming in on different sections. "Complete overhaul of your water systems, obviously. New valves, better pressure regulation, temperature controls that actually make sense for someone with scales. But that's just the start." He swiped to show her the counter modifications. "Lower these by about 15 centimeters. Puts them at the perfect height for you to work comfortably. Won't have to strain or reach awkward angles anymore." Another swipe. "Storage units get moved down too. Everything you use regularly should be within easy reach. The stuff you don't use often can stay up high, but daily items? Those should be accessible." He showed her the environmental controls next, and Zichrea realized he'd repositioned every single panel in her quarters. Temperature, lighting, air circulation, humidity controls. All of them moved to places where she could actually reach them without straining or asking for help. "Motion sensors," Tom continued, clearly excited about this part. "I can calibrate them specifically to your chair's movement patterns. Right now they're set for human walking speeds and heights. That's why your lights sometimes don't turn on fast enough or turn off while you're still in the room. We fix the sensors, that problem goes away." Zichrea stared at the designs, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Every adjustment was thoughtful. Practical. Designed specifically for her body, her needs, her life. "Took me about 4 hours, Tom said, scrolling through more pages of notes and calculations. "Station engineers can implement it if you approve. Shouldn't take more than a day, maybe 2 if they're backed up with the summit stuff." Zichrea's throat tightened. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You did this on your own time?" "Well, yeah." Tom looked at her like she'd asked if water was wet. "You shouldn't have to fight your own living space every day. That's not right." He shrugged like it was obvious, like it was the only reasonable response. "Where I come from, we've got a saying my dad taught me when I was a kid. The universe isn't built fair, so we build tools to fix that. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, but Zitreya felt something crack inside her chest. She'd spent 2 years believing the universe was fair, that her injury was divine punishment, that her inability to adapt to this space was her own weakness. Tom had just casually dismantled that entire belief system in one sentence. Before she could find words to respond, Tom picked up the insulated container he'd brought with him. Also, I checked your species' dietary restrictions in the station database last night. Figured chocolate should be safe? If I got it wrong, please don't eat it. He opened the container and Zitreya stared at what was inside. A human birthday cake. Small and simple, nothing fancy. Round with white frosting that had been spread a bit unevenly, like someone had done it by hand rather than with machines. On top, written in slightly shaky letters that clearly showed human handwriting, were the words, "Happy Hatching Day, Empress." Beneath the cake was a card. Tom pulled it out and handed it to her. Zitreya's claws trembled as she took it. The card was just plain station stationery, folded in half. But when she opened it, her vision blurred. 23 signatures. 23 names she barely recognized. The maintenance crew. The dock workers. The cafeteria staff. The cargo handlers. People who worked in the depths of the station, keeping it running while diplomats had their meetings and made their deals. People she passed in corridors but had never really seen. People who'd never said more than a polite greeting to her. Every single one had signed their name and written a small message. Happy birthday, Ambassador. Hope your day is wonderful. Wishing you the best. You deserve a great celebration. Told a few people it was your birthday yesterday, Tom explained, watching her face. Word spread pretty quick. The maintenance crew wanted to do something nice. We all chipped in. Hope that's okay. Zitreya couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely. She looked at the cake, at the card, at this human standing in her quarters who'd spent 4 hours redesigning her living space because he couldn't stop thinking about how uncomfortable it must be for her. For the first time in 2 years, Zitreya felt moisture gathering in her eyes. Humans cried when they felt strong emotions. She'd learned that during her diplomatic training, studied it as an academic fact. She'd seen it happen but never understood it, never felt it herself. Until now. The tears came hot and unexpected, sliding down her scaled cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. Hey, whoa, it's okay, Tom said gently, looking concerned. If this is too much, I can. No, Zitreya managed, her voice breaking. No, this is perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Tom smiled then, those creases around his eyes deepening. Happy birthday, Empress. Nobody should spend it alone. Word spread through Station Meridian 7 like fire through dry brush. Nobody quite knew who started it. Maybe it was someone from the maintenance crew who'd signed that birthday card. Maybe it was one of the dock workers who'd heard about Tom redesigning the ambassador's quarters. Maybe it was just the way news traveled on a station where everyone knew everyone else's business. But within 3 days, half the station knew that the fallen dragon Empress wasn't so fallen after all. It started with small visits. A Tyrellian engineer named Krevix knocked on her door one afternoon, his 4 arms carrying a data slate. He'd heard she'd been advocating for accessible docking procedures in the station's recent safety review, something she'd mentioned casually in a report nobody thought she'd care about. Those procedures would make it easier for ships with injured crews to dock safely, and Krevix wanted to thank her personally. His sister had been paralyzed in a mining accident, and those new procedures meant she could still work as a pilot. I thought nobody read those reports, Zitreya admitted. The humans read everything, Krevix said with a clicking laugh. They're thorough like that. A vexed diplomat stopped by the next day, bringing tea from her homeworld. She talked for an hour about how human patrol ships had protected refugee vessels during the Outer Rim crisis 5 years ago, when no other species would get involved. Her family had been on one of those ships. The humans had escorted them for 3 weeks through hostile territory, asking nothing in return. They just said it was the right thing to do, the diplomat explained, her translucent skin shimmering with emotion. No treaty required it. No law demanded it. They just did it. Each visitor shared stories. Stories of human kindness when kindness made no logical sense. Human stubbornness when every reasonable person would quit. Human refusal to accept impossible as an answer when faced with problems that seemed unsolvable. Zitreya began to see a pattern emerging, clear as starlight. Humans didn't measure worth by physical perfection or combat prowess. They didn't care if you could walk or fly or swim. They measured value by resilience, by compassion, by what you chose to do with whatever you had. A plumber could redesign quarters because it was right. A maintenance crew could celebrate a stranger's birthday because nobody should be alone. A station of humans could see an exiled empress and think, what can she teach us, instead of what use is she now? Her quarters, now redesigned with Tom's modifications, became a gathering place. The changes made everything easier. She could reach her own temperature controls. The lights responded properly to her movements. The water ran at the temperature her scales preferred. But more than that, the space felt welcoming in a way it never had before. It felt like somewhere people wanted to be. Young exiles from various species started seeking her out. A creche whose wings had been damaged. A forlorn who'd lost an arm. A human woman whose legs had been crushed in a cargo accident. They came because they'd heard about the dragon empress who'd lost her throne but found something better. They came because they needed to hear from someone who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself when everything you'd based your identity on was gone. HFY offered counsel freely, drawing on decades of political and strategic knowledge her people had thrown away along with her. She'd commanded fleets, negotiated treaties, balanced competing interests across 12 star systems. That knowledge didn't vanish when her legs stopped working. She just needed someone to remind her it still mattered. When the critical trade negotiations stalled in week 2 of the summit, threatening 3 human colonies with economic collapse, HFY heard about it through the vexed diplomat. The negotiators had hit a wall with a Scholarics trade consortium. Cultural misunderstandings. Missed signals. Offers made at the wrong time in the wrong way. HFY requested a meeting with Station Commander Beverly Hayes. The commander arrived within an hour, looking exhausted from 2 weeks of diplomatic crisis management. HFY laid out everything. Intricate details of Scholarics trade routes that weren't in any public database. Political alliances between consortium members that determined who had real power and who was just posturing. Pressure points the human negotiators hadn't known existed. Specific phrases that would signal respect without showing weakness. Times of day when offers should be made based on Scholarics circadian rhythms. Commander Hayes stared at her datapad, then at HFY, then back at the datapad. You've been sitting on this information for 2 years? No one asked, HFY replied simply. She kept her voice neutral, but there was weight behind the words. They saw a broken empress. Not a knowledgeable one. Hayes closed her eyes and took a deep breath. That's on us. That's entirely on us. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, HFY said. Just use it. The treaty was signed within a week. 3 human colonies were saved from bankruptcy. 2 others got trade advantages they hadn't even known to ask for. The Scholarics consortium got mining rights they'd wanted for years. Everyone walked away satisfied. Tom stopped by to check on his modifications the day after the signing. He found HFY's quarters full of activity. She was surrounded by datapads and star charts, working with a team of human strategists on a follow-up agreement. Someone had brought coffee. Someone else had brought food. The room hummed with focused energy. Tom stood in the doorway, grinning. Guess the plumbing's working out? HFY looked up from a particularly complex trade route calculation and felt her crest lift with genuine happiness. More than the plumbing. You reminded me that an empress is not defined by her legs, but by her wisdom, her leadership, and her courage to stand even while sitting. Tom's grin softened into something more genuine. You did that yourself. I just fixed a leaky pipe. 6 months transformed everything. HFY's quarters became the unofficial heart of Meridian 7's diplomatic community. What started with a few curious visitors became a steady stream of people seeking advice, collaboration, or just conversation. Her strategic insights had prevented 2 conflicts before they escalated past angry words. She'd brokered 5 major trade agreements that nobody else could have pulled off. Each success built on the last, and word spread far beyond the station. Young exiles from a dozen different species called her Empress again, but not because of her old title. They called her that because she'd earned a new one. She'd become someone who understood loss and chose to build anyway. Someone who'd been broken by her own people's standards and proved those standards were wrong. The morning the Scholarics envoy arrived, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. HFY was reviewing agricultural reports with a human trade specialist when her console chimed with an urgent message. Official diplomatic vessel requesting permission to dock. Scholarics Empire. Her hearts both skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from her people in over 2 years. Not one message. Not one inquiry. Nothing but silence and the clear message that she'd been erased from their history. Now they wanted to talk. The envoy was announced exactly 1 hour later. HFY had her quarters cleared of work materials, though she left Tom's modifications visible. The lower counters. The accessible controls. The motion sensors that actually worked for her. She wanted the envoy to see how she lived now. The door opened and in walked Kreftar, one of her nephew's high counselors. She remembered him from her days ruling. He'd been ambitious then, always calculating his next move up the power structure. He looked exactly the same. Pristine ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine. Crest raised high in that arrogant way that said he believed he was superior to everyone in the room. Wings folded with military precision. He stopped 3 paces from her chair and gave the shallowest possible bow that could still technically be called respectful. Ambassador Zitreya, he said, and she noticed he didn't use her royal name. The council has reconsidered your situation. Your recent diplomatic successes have been noted. Your expertise is clearly valuable. Valuable, Zitreya repeated, keeping her voice neutral. Indeed. Kreftar's crest lifted higher. The council acknowledges that your condition can be overlooked given your recent accomplishments. We need your wisdom. The Empire faces complex negotiations with 3 neighboring powers, and our current advisors lack your experience. You would return as Chief Diplomatic Counselor. Not Empress, of course, but a position of significant honor. Around her, the quarters Tom had redesigned hummed with life through the thin walls. She could hear voices in the corridor. Laughter from the human maintenance crew taking their break. The sound of a Turellian child playing some game that involved lots of happy shrieking. This place was alive in a way her palace had never been. Zitreya looked at Kreftar for a long moment. She saw everything he wasn't saying. They didn't want her back because they'd realized they were wrong. They wanted her back because she was useful now. A tool they could use. They'd overlook her condition, as long as she produced results. And the moment she stopped being useful, they'd discard her again. No, she said simply. Kreftar's crest flattened in confusion. No? Ambassador, perhaps you didn't understand. This is an extraordinary offer. The council is willing to. I understood perfectly, Zitreya interrupted. And my answer is no. You would refuse to serve your empire? His voice rose with indignation. I would refuse to serve an empire that measures worth by the wrong standards. Zitreya's crest rose proudly, higher than it had in years. I have built something better here. An empire where value is not determined by biology, but by character. Where strength means lifting others, not standing over them. She gestured around her quarters. Through the window she could see humans and aliens working together on the docking platforms. In the corridor that Turellian child raced past, chased by a laughing human friend. You taught me I was worthless because I could not walk, Zitreya continued. These humans taught me I was priceless because I could think, lead and care. They saw someone who needed help and they helped. They saw potential and they nurtured it. They saw a person, not a broken tool. I know which empire I prefer. Kreftar stared at her, scandalized. The council will not offer again. Good. I hope they learn something from this rejection. But I doubt they will. The envoy left in disgrace, his wings stiff with anger. Zitreya watched him go and felt nothing but relief. Tom visited one last time 3 weeks later. He was being transferred to a new station, promoted to Chief of Engineering. He looked uncomfortable in his dress uniform, kept tugging at the collar. Hate these fancy clothes, he muttered. Give me a jumpsuit any day. Zitreya had been preparing for this visit. She brought out a long, wrapped package and presented it with both clawed hands. Tom unwrapped it carefully and went very still. Escalaric's honor blade. The highest gift her people could give. The blade was ceremonial, engraved with patterns that told stories in a language Tom couldn't read. But the inscription along the edge was in both languages, clear enough for anyone to understand. The truest strength lies in lifting others. This is. Tom's voice caught. This is too much. It is exactly right, Zitreya said firmly. You didn't save a fallen empress. You taught her how to build a new empire. One where everyone belongs. Tom smiled, weathered and warm, those creases around his eyes deepening. I just fixed your plumbing, ma'am. You fixed much more than that. You fixed the way I saw myself. You fixed the way I understood what strength means. You fixed my future. After Tom left, Zitreya turned to her viewport. The stars shone brighter now against the darkness of space. Not because they had changed, but because she had. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost that she couldn't see what she'd gained. A new purpose. New friends. A new way of measuring what mattered. And it all started with a plumber who saw a person, not a problem. Who saw someone struggling and decided to help, not because it benefited him but because it was right. In the end, that was the most human thing of all. They built tools to fix unfairness. They refused to accept that anyone was broken beyond worth. They lifted others not because those others could repay them, but because strength meant nothing if you didn't use it to help. HFY had been a dragon empress once. Now she was something better. She was someone who belonged.